And we're back. All right, I'm going to try to let that person in one more time. I don't know. I feel bad for them. Hopefully. Oh, now they're in. That's good. All right, whoever it is that can't get in, I was trying, I promise. Okay, so we're going to start from the beginning, which I guess is always a good place to start. Hopefully you were able to figure out how you're going to get access to the book. Either you begged the book principal at your school to let you have a copy, or you found one online. I think they're pretty easy to rent online, but excuse me, I don't know if the online book thing works nicely for you. I assume it does because you guys are young people and, you know, knowledge. All right, enough of that. Let me see if I can find the, dang, how did that happen? Sorry. Find the weekly questions. There it is, weekly questions. Okay, so you've probably noticed this on the Blackboard page. Hopefully it should be on the course documents page. And also, excuse me, allergies, I believe. Also listed individually, the questions are listed individually on the assignments page, which is where you turn stuff in. And be sure to save a copy of everything that you submit, everything you submit. And if for some reason it goes in, you know, you think you've submitted and you don't get a grade for it pretty quickly, please let me know. Kind of dealing with somebody from last semester who didn't get a grade on something for a month and a half and didn't tell me, and I don't see it and they think I should give them a grade. And that's a tricky spot for both of us. So make sure you save a copy. Always save a copy. You know this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Okay. All right. So our question for this week, and we'll talk about it some today, maybe a little next time if we need to. Sorry. Compare Indian society, Native American society, Indigenous society, whatever word you would like to use. Apologies if that was, you know, not your word. With that of Europeans, what differences were there, similarities? Be sure to include in your analysis ideas about religion, land, and gender roles. So those are the three big things you want to talk about. And pick, if you would like, pick a couple of specific tribes and compare them with a couple of specific European groups. But you'll notice some generalizations that work fairly well with the natives, the indigenous folks who lived on the East Coast, and still some do live on the East Coast of what becomes the United States. Sorry for all that coughing today. And one thing you'll notice, there are some tribes where Native American women maybe have more leadership roles than Native American or than European women do. And of course, religion. And with the land, the discussion will probably be a lot about land use, what's appropriate land use, and what's who owns the land. How do you decide who owns the land? Because that's going to be a point of difference. Excuse me, that'll be fairly substantial. You know, that'll be fairly important as we move along. And also what they thought was appropriate land use. I'm not talking so much about conservation. Nobody's really, you know, people aren't really wasting stuff yet. It's a little early in society to be wasting stuff, if that makes any sense. So, all right, we start to look at the notes then. And let me check before we get started. Do you guys have any questions about anything from day two, where or day one, where we talked about the syllabus? Are you having any questions or concerns? Are you able to find everything on Blackboard? Is everything good? Thumbs up. Okay, all right. Yeah. Okay, just checking. All right then, let's get started with the notes then. Very exciting, actual history. Woo, okay. Maybe you watched the inauguration, actual history. I always like to watch those. Those are fun for me. You guys are going like, no, we were at school. I know, you had school. But I was off, so I got to watch it. And it was fun. To me, it's always a nice reminder that even, you know, You like the new person, you don't like the new person. They're coming in, it's going to be all right. They'll stay 4 or 8 years, then we'll get a different one. So it'll be fine either way. There's a quote from Adam Smith. The reason, I don't know, as a US historian, we don't really care about economics or economists very often, but Adam Smith is one of the economists we care about. So when I get to quote him, I'm going to do that. He's the guy that came up with essentially the idea of capitalism, sort of, or at least put it into words, but okay. And he's a Scottish economist, I think. Yeah, Scottish economist. He also talks about why it's important to have colonies and how colonies should be run for the financial benefit of the mother country. That'll come up later. Okay, but anyway, there's a quote from Adam Smith that says, "The discovery of America, one of the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind." Well, and you know, for his purposes, that is likely true. So it must be true, right? And if you're from what becomes the UK, yeah, no, that makes sense. And this will be some of the first recorded interaction between people of different continents. I know Vikings and other folks, you know, traveled before as well. There's just not as much recorded about it. And this chapter goes way back. And as far as, oh, and I'll have the list of things you should start studying for the quiz. I should have that by tomorrow, some point tomorrow. But this chapter really covers like 20,000 years of history at least in 30 pages or 25 pages. So it's pretty fast. Yeah, it's like riding a roller coaster. So it's kind of hard to figure what's the big stuff, what's the small stuff. So that's why the list will be important for you. And on the question, of course, the weekly question just focus on some groups once there's interaction. But first Americans probably crossed on the Bering Strait up there by Alaska, walked over, had to do with early climate change, ice ages, that sort of stuff. Probably when larger animals died, like the giant, I don't know, elephant-looking things, mammoths, and maybe dinosaurs. Yeah, that sort of thing. And what starts to happen is people start to, some students, groups start to grow their own food. So agriculture develops, and then civilizations start to pop up all over what we think of as the Americas. All right, and this is going to talk about different parts of the Americas. So in modern day Mexico, the Aztecs were kind of the major empire. You may have studied those folks a little bit in world history. They could be a little rough at times, but they also had really well-developed civilizations. They had really, oops, sorry, somebody's coming in, and I'm coughing. They also had pretty advanced types of mathematics, the idea of the zero. They're good at science. They built pyramids. You know all this stuff, okay? And the Incans, probably very similar in technology and knowledge to the Aztecs, less likely to rip your heart out for ceremonies and things like that. And certainly the Aztecs, you know, more warlike, had better military. Yeah, we could think of them as military. So they didn't have, the Incas are going to be in some trouble because they didn't have good weapons. And that's also a historical thing, isn't it? If your weapons aren't as good, sometimes people take you over. When you have civilizations that grow to be this large, it's because you have consistent sources of water and food. And once you can take care of water and food, then you can build pyramids and roads and write stuff down and have artwork and things like that. So once you take care of the basic needs of your society, then your society grows, and then you develop something that we think of more as culture. So if you're wondering, like in the modern day United States, do we have larger groups? Not so much. Tended to be smaller groups. Where I'm from, the great state of Missouri, mound building cultures, we're pretty familiar with them in, I think the book calls it, well, it is Cahokia. And there's some other, I forgot, I'll think about it later. Some other mound building cities that your book talks about quite a bit. These folks really build burial mounds, and they bury stuff with people who die. So it's sort of like what the Egyptian cultures would do, only in mounds of dirt instead of pyramids or underground crypts, that sort of thing. But the reason those things matter is it gives us some idea about their material culture, the stuff they use, the stuff they developed, and also gives us an idea how large their groups were. So if there's a whole lot of stuff left, then we know there were a whole lot of stuff, there were a whole lot of people. And if there aren't as many, then we know there weren't as many. But in North America, what becomes the United States, probably the largest cultures in colder climates were in the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. And those cities probably got up to about 300,000. You'll also notice that's convergence of some rivers. So that's always good for trade and travel, which people didn't travel very much then, of course, but they did trade, when they could. Hopi and Sunni cultures were southwestern, and they lived in cliffs and canyons. And you may have visited places like that. We think of them sometimes as pueblos. Constructed dams, canals, and of course, water is going to be a crucial resource in the Southwest because there's not that much of it, which is why farmers get super excited when it rains, even though you don't. And they tended to grow corn and beans, squash, maybe cotton, they could turn it into stuff. And these guys are going to be referred to as Pueblo cultures by Spanish explorers. And your book will talk quite a bit about a revolt by some folks in modern day New Mexico, led by a guy named El Pope. And it's sometimes called Pope's Rebellion or the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. And there's a lot of frustration because the Spanish folks, people like trading with Spanish folks, because you make money and you get different stuff. I guess you don't really make money, but you get stuff that you didn't have before. And we like other people's stuff. So the natives like the Spanish people stuff, and the Spanish people like the native stuff. They go, oh, that's cool. We don't have squash back in Spain, or whatever it is they were trading for. Beans. They had beans in Spain. Probably. But what people got frustrated about with the Spanish is they said, oh, we're here. And you notice this with European explorers, but I think any culture kind of does this. They show up and they go like, we're here, we're taking over, and you're adopting our culture. So the part of the culture that the Spanish were pretty forceful about was Catholicism, was Christianity. And the natives were not necessarily thrilled with having to, with being forced to become Catholic. So that's going to be a source of contention. And maybe not the major reason for the revolt, but a pretty strong part of it. And also, when somebody else shows up to where you live and says, I'm here and I'm establishing rules for you, that's pretty weird. So they rose up against that. And then, it kind of depends on whose story you like about the Pueblo revolt, how it's resolved. But eventually the Spanish and the Pueblos begin trading again, and it's probably much more of a mutually beneficial relationship where the Spanish don't really try to say like, hey, we're in charge. They go like, hey, we would like some squash. So it's a little more friendly. So sorry, I blame Cedar. And then the folks who live along the East Coast, the part that becomes the original colonies, those groups are pretty small, and that probably makes sense with the weather and climate and that sort of thing. And they're kind of hunter-gatherer, fishers, that sort of thing, depending on where they live. If you live on the coast, your main source of food is probably going to be from the water. If you live a little more inland, you're probably hunting more. They're going to gather berries and whatever grows in that region of the country, which I assume is mostly berries, and then maybe, I don't know what else grows there. And they may have raised some food crops, but because it's cold there, stuff doesn't grow for as long. So, it has a shorter growing season. These native groups tended to form confederations. They didn't always like each other. Sometimes they would fight over hunting areas. Sometimes they would have tribal interactions that led to fights. But and sometimes their language groups were similar, sometimes they weren't, but they do mention these different groups that work together for trade and relations with outside groups. So maybe they'd form a confederation of some sort, and then they would deal with other confederations, really to enhance trade and to protect their areas, that sort of thing. Now, the populations in these areas were relatively small. So if you have an idea that these groups were always fighting with each other, they probably weren't. They probably weren't, because there's a lot of territory. There aren't so many people. You do see more of the aggressive cultures, really, I'll just say where it's warmer. It does tend to happen where it's warmer because the civilizations tend to be larger, and because they expand, they impinge on each other's, or infringe, either way, on each other's territory. And you also see later on Plains Indians being, Plains tribes being more aggressive, and some of that has to do with how they make a living, and some of that has to do with some of those groups being forced to a new area and feeling, really territorial over the new land because they're concerned they might lose it like they lost the old land. Okay, so the groups Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, or depending on where you live. When I lived in Missouri, sometimes they would call these guys Chickasha, which I don't think is correct, but you know how that goes. The five Iroquois people: Mohawk, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and Onondaga. And most of these groups, again, got along pretty well, tried to figure out how to communicate with each other. And their language is sometimes similar, but rarely exactly the same. Animism is really more of a religious system that's common within these groups, but their types of religious beliefs, the spirits that they thought were more important, were not the same from group to group. So animism, more an idea that there are spirits within everything, and it's not really, let me think about religion. So Western religion tends to be monotheistic, where you've got one God and creation comes from that one God. Animism is a little more like there are eternal spirits in everything, and there are different sorts of spirits that emanate from different sorts of gods. So it's it does certainly have more than one God. It may have an idea of a creator or a creation, but they tend to think that everything has a spirit, everything has value. Not that people who are monotheistic don't think everything has value. They just see it in a different way. Okay. They also see the land a little bit more as a resource that everyone's supposed to use, and you're supposed to share, not necessarily share well, because they did fight with each other and say like, no, this is the land that we're going to use. But they didn't feel like they had a deed, or that they owned it, or that they could sell it. And that's going to be a big difference between native groups in the Americas and people who come over from Europe, because people who come over from Europe will definitely think that you can own the land and that you can have title to it and that you can sell it or buy it. And that's going to lead to lots of misunderstandings, maybe some treaties that are signed by people who don't really understand what they're doing, that sort of thing. Okay. I can guarantee you that I will ask you on the quiz about the meaning of the Colombian Exchange, but I will also assume that you've heard of this before so that you will have a general idea of it. And it's just be a general thing. The idea that once people came over from the Americas, Columbus perhaps being, one of the early people, hence Colombian Exchange, that they traded stuff. So the Colombian Exchange is the transfer of population, crops, material culture. Material culture is just stuff, like your pottery or your clothing or what you live in, that sort of stuff. But also disease, which of course we don't trade on purpose, but crud, the last year, that's kind of been we've talked a lot about how you share disease and germs and things like that, and whether there are immunities to certain diseases. And what you'll notice is that when you live in a group of people, whatever your disease is, whether it's the flu or smallpox or that sort of thing, which was kind of the European stuff, that once people got that and shared it, that you might have started to develop some natural, or not natural immunity, but some group immunity, herd immunity, as it were, just from people getting the diseases. And your group is isolated from other people's groups. So whatever diseases they share among themselves, they may have immunity to those diseases and you don't. And then you've got immunity to your diseases, but you don't have immunity to theirs. So when you guys mix and you guys swap diseases, stuff that might make them cough and sneeze might kill you. So there you go. And that's probably why most Native Americans died, because they didn't have any natural immunities or built up. I guess no one has natural immunities, but herd immunities, biological immunity, group immunity to things like measles, smallpox, and the flu. Yeah. And if you're wondering, did Native Americans share anything a little rough with Europeans? They did. They did. But those mostly were, for whatever reason, sexually transmitted diseases. Yeah. So, oops, there you go. And for whatever reason, the natives had more immunity to that stuff that I read somewhere. I'm not old enough to know, but that doesn't seem to be nearly as big a problem as the flu, because, some of those diseases are harder to catch than, the flu. Someone sneezes on you, they may have shared the germs with you, or blows their nose and, rubs their hand on you or something, The other types of diseases that Native Americans maybe have more immunity to, those are harder to share. You don't share those accidentally. Okay. And Native Americans tended to be more culturally isolated. They didn't travel as much. They probably, if they sailed somewhere or, used a boat to go somewhere is down the river, they weren't going across the ocean because their trading societies were closer, that sort of thing. And so much more isolated groups. All right, quick switch to religion. Yay for religion. This is also the era, and religion can be a little complicated for lots of folks, especially if you did not grow up in a religious tradition. Some of this is all like, I never heard of this stuff. So I'm going to tell you some very basic, just use for history class, religious stuff. We're not converting each other or anything, but okay. So religious groups that we will deal with a lot in US history are probably Christian religious groups, okay? Now, just for our discussion, we could argue about this if you wanted, but so early. Do you really want to argue about stuff? There are two major groups within Christianity that developed during this time period. We have Catholics and not Catholics, okay? So everyone who's Catholic knows they're Catholic. Like you go to church, it's Catholic church, you know. Not Catholics, the big group are called Protestants, okay? Protestants, we got Catholics and Protestants. And the Protestants developed during this time period, during the Reformation, okay? And the Protestants came from Catholics, like Martin Luther, who said like, hey, I really love the church, things are going well, except for these 95 things I have a problem with. So he made a list of 95 things, tacked it on the door at the church, and said, we should talk about these things. And they said, we should kick you out. And then they ended up fighting, and then the church ended up splitting, and then you end up with the Catholic Church and the Protestant group. And the tricky part about the Protestant group is it turns into 50,000 other groups eventually. So if you're Christian, but you don't attend a Catholic church, you are Protestant for our purposes. Even though you're going like, no, I'm Baptist. Like, yeah, I got it, you're Baptist, but That's one of the 8 million groups within the Protestant part of the Christian church. And then sometimes I would have Catholic students who would tell me, no, I'm not Christian, I'm Catholic. It's like, no, you're both. You're both. You're both Christian and Catholic. So got Christianity is the big overlying group, and you got Catholics and Protestants, okay, for our purposes. I know we could make it more complicated, but just for us. And the Protestants were the group that split away after Martin Luther said, like, here are 95 things that I'd like for you to fix. And they said, shut up, essentially. They said a lot more than that. Okay. And also Martin Luther, it's really, we just had Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Not the same. Sorry. Definitely not the same guy. They may have shared a few beliefs, but probably not as many as you would think. And I think a lot of times people think that Martin Luther was this big reform-minded guy. And he did want some reforms, but he's not going to be as big into reform as you think. I mean, he still thinks that the church should have a lot of power over people's lives, and he doesn't like the idea of revolution at all. As a matter of fact, within Germany, when there were certain groups of people who were trying to push back against the church, he kind of wanted them squashed and jailed. So he really is not a social revolutionary in any way, but his biggest concern was indulgences, which we won't talk about for very long because it's not, a religious history class. But the Catholic Church wanted you to, and still does, want you to go to confession. And when you go to confession, the priest will say, like, you've sinned. Here are the things you need to do to make up for your sins. And it typically includes some prayers and some righteous acts, that sort of thing. In the old days, it could also include a check. I know it wasn't a check, but you could make a payment for your sins or for the sins of your predecessors, your ancestors, to help them get forgiven. And Martin Luther said, hey, I don't think that's a real spiritual process, or it's not theologically sound. He says, we can't take money to forgive sins. That's just not cool. It's not what God intended. There's nothing within our text that says that's a good idea. And it also infringes upon the rights of people who are poor and, don't own anything, which I guess means that they're poor, right? So the church made money through indulgences, so they weren't super excited about getting rid of them. Plus, during this time period, the church was not just the church, they were also the government, Holy Roman Empire sort of thing, even though that's on the decline. Certainly the Catholic Church played an enormous part in the government in Spain and Portugal, as you probably remember. Okay, all right. And people are also going to complain that when the Spanish and the Portuguese travel overseas, and they're pushing the idea of God, gold, and glory, which I trust you remember from 8th grade, that they are often mistreating the people that they come across. And the person who talks about that the most, who I'm sure will probably show up on your quiz as well, is this Bartolomé de las Casas. And this fellow was a priest, so he's not opposed to the Catholic Church, but he's saying that the people we're encountering have souls and are children of God, and mistreating them is not only a sin, it also ruins the reputation of the church. So we're trying to share the church, spread God, and get golden glory as we do that. But if the first G really is God, then we can't enslave people. Now, one of the super controversial things about De las Casas' writing is initially when he writes, he says, we should not enslave natives in the Americas because they're so much like us that they're God's children. We should be converting them, treating them well, building churches for them, that sort of thing. If you want to enslave people, the folks we should enslave are from Africa because those guys are useless. It's not exactly how he said it, but it's like, not sure they have a soul. They're kind of a mess. They're much more naturally inclined to be servants. That's who we should enslave. And then about 10 years later, he goes, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that. We know they're people as well, and we should convert them. We shouldn't enslave anybody. So, he doesn't come to that conclusion right away, but he comes to that conclusion eventually. And he writes something called Short Account, what's later called, he didn't call it this, Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, where it talks about 50 years of the Spanish in the Americas mistreating natives. And the idea is he's sending this to the King of Spain, and he really wants the King of Spain to force the conquistadores and to change and to revise the encomienda system to where people don't owe tribute and they aren't essentially enslaved, because it makes the church look bad. And if God is really the first of the three G's, then we need to act like God is the first of the three G's. And the king went, that's interesting. Dang, we make a lot of money from this, so they didn't really change anything. It also encourages the development of something called the Black Legend, which Protestant European countries really enjoy, and they talk about how bad the Catholic nations, primarily Spain and Portugal, are, and how evil they are, and it justifies taking over their empires because they were so evil and mistreated natives so badly. Okay. All right. So Black Legend idea. Oh my goodness, we've really ripped through these notes quickly. Sorry. The Black Legend idea that I is kind of restated here, accusing the Catholic Church, Catholic nations of atrocities, improprieties, and it will be used by the British to denigrate the Spanish. And conquistadores do keep journals about their travels and how they treat natives and that sort of stuff. So if you ever read the Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, I know you're not going to. You could read that for your book review if you wanted to. It's relatively short, hence the name. He had a longer one and thought, oh, the king will never read this. So he revised it down from probably what would have been 1,000 pages to about 200. But what you would notice if you read this, because I have, is it just talks about all the horrible things that were done to natives by Spanish conquistadores, and they did keep records of this. So certainly all of the stories in there are true. There's a feeling sometimes by historians that they might be slightly exaggerated. I don't know that they necessarily are, but I think the way that it's written makes it seem like it happened on a daily basis, or that it was constantly happening all the time. I'm not saying, because if you ever read this book, you go like, oh my gosh, that's horrible, because it is horrible, it is. But I think the way that it's put together makes it seem like it was a daily practice. And what he's done is combine stuff that he's read about and heard about over a 50-year period into a smaller collection of stories. So it condenses 50 years of history into a couple hundred pages, which probably makes it, the timeline seem odd. Yeah, we'll just go with that. But, okay. There are French explorers and Dutch explorers as well that we just don't seem to care as much about because it's US history. The French probably impact us a little more, the Dutch some as well. French primarily in modern day Canada, looking for the Northwest Passage. So they're thinking maybe they can go across the globe, sailing across what's modern day Canada. And of course, they don't have good maps or anything. They're making the maps as they go. So, they're exploring. So they find out that you can't really do that. But they do take some nice trips down the Mississippi River, which is also why if you've been to cities along the Mississippi River, there's a lot of French cultural influence. I guess the one you'd probably go to the most here would be New Orleans. Where I grew up, it would have been St. Louis, where there's a lot of French cultural influence. You'd be surprised. But, along the Mississippi River. Also is going to lead to lots of interaction between Native Americans and French for trade, and why you'll notice some of the Plains tribes have some French assigned names like Nez Perce and stuff. You go like, wow, that's weird. But yeah, it is true. Okay. Their colonizers are primarily men rather than families, which makes them different than the British, because the British sometimes will bring over families and start farms, and then they'll have new families, and then they go constantly more westward and take over more land. With the French, they're either priests or soldiers or just dudes that wanted some land, not too many families. So they tend to be really interested in trade and intermarriage, except the priests who probably didn't do that. So you will see French culture blend with Native culture because dudes marry Native American women or Native women, Native Canadian, Indigenous women. French will also bring priests to convert the natives. And the French and natives tend to get along better because there's not as many French and they don't bring as many armies. And as a rule, they're not taking over as much land. And they're much more likely to assimilate. Even their priests are much more likely to assimilate into native cultures rather than insist that the natives learn Latin or French or whatever, and that they come to church but stand out on the plaza because it's, they're too unclean to actually come inside. So the French and the natives tend to get along pretty nicely, is what I'm saying. And there tends to be much more cultural assimilation there because the numbers are smaller. And when there's a war later on, like the French and Indian War, that's really the British fighting against a lot of French and Native American tribes because they tended to side with the Native Americans because the Native Americans tended to treat them better. Okay, and then the Dutch, you like them. They're just like modern capitalist kind of dudes. They go like, hey, let's make some money. So their goal is always trade. They're going to go places where they can interact with a lot of folks and then send back stuff to the Netherlands, sell stuff. So they want to make money. So wherever they live, they're like, we don't care what religion you are, you're probably going to have more rights there. And they're not like, we are establishing a Dutch empire in the rest of the world. It's like, nope, we're just trading. So these guys are just super capitalist kind of dudes. Although I don't know that they would consider themselves capitalist in this era. They don't want to convert you. They probably don't want to take over your land. They're not going to build a big farm as a rule. They just want to buy your stuff and they want you to buy their stuff. And if you're happy, they're happy, and everybody's making money there. So their big colony in the Americas will be New Netherland or New Amsterdam. And then that will magically turn into New York later on when the British go like, hey, we could take that over. They don't have an army. And that's pretty much what happens. Okay. Now, since our question was about Native American groups, I don't know, do you have, that's the book, see the book? Let me stop sharing. We have a couple of minutes to talk about this. So one of the nice things about the book, I really want you to use the book, is it's pretty straightforward stuff. And it's going to have nice little headings that will kind of direct you to where you need to go to find out about the different groups. So it has different sections that we kind of cover generally, where it'll say Indian societies of the Americas, where it'll talk about the Aztecs and the Incas, and then mound builders of the Mississippi culture, and it'll tell you more information about those guys. Western Indians, which we'll think of as the Pueblo kind of groups, and then Northeastern American Indians. It'll talk about those folks. Then it has a section where it talks about Native American religion, and then land and property. So, and then gender relations. So it will talk in there about how, in general, men and women have fairly defined roles in some ways, but some Native American cultures trace their lineage through the women. And one of the things that you will notice if you study this in much more depth than the textbook will give you is that where women control more property, women are going to have more rights. And that probably makes sense. So in societies where they're more agriculturally based and women tended to be in charge of the agriculture, they also have more political power. So if you control the food, which is the main source of life, then you're probably going to have more political power. And they will also talk about how they viewed sex was different, and how sometimes women lived alone for a longer period of time before they got married, which is not European at all. Women never lived alone on their own, any of that sort of thing, with their family, and then with either their husband came to their family, which wasn't as common in European culture, or they moved in with their husband's family, that sort of thing. But women also did hunting and fishing and that sort of stuff as well. And sometimes we're in charge of religious practices, so it's different. And then there'll be a little section where it talks about how Europeans saw Native Americans, which tended to be, at first when the numbers of Europeans were small, they tended to be more admiring, more respectful, that sort of thing. But then pretty quickly, especially with their religious practices, they saw them as kind of backward. They would see them as, I don't know, spirit worshippers, or they worshiped the devil. They said that they had false gods, that their religious leaders were witch doctors, that sort of thing. And they aren't going to like the family structure at all either. One of the things that European men thought was strange about Native American culture is that a lot of times the agriculturally based societies, the women were in charge of the agriculture. And for most European societies, agriculture was the way you made a living. So the men saw Native American men who went hunting as lazy. They said that because sometimes hunting for Europeans was sport of rich people. So they thought, well, this culture is really weird. They make the women do all the hard work, and the men go out and just kind of hunt for fun. So they thought that the women were a little rough and a little too like physical, I suppose, like scary. And they thought that the men were lazy and soft, which is kind of interesting cultural misunderstanding. So, but the book will give you a little more detail. Now, for the weekly question, I realize it's going to be fairly general. It is. So you may talk about generalities about Eastern tribes, Pueblo tribes, Southwestern tribes, and generalities about South and or Mexican and Aztecs and the Incas. Just say that. So you're not going to talk about every tribe that ever existed. You probably talk about them by groups. So when you start working on the weekly question, which I would suggest that you do relatively soon rather than wait last minute, just look for the chapter headings in the book. This is really supposed to be pretty simple, pretty straightforward. And if you have questions about the weekly question, write up a draft of it, send it to me ahead of time in an email and say like, hey, does this look good enough? And I'll say like, yeah, that looks good. Or nah, maybe you want to add this. Someone always wants to ask, so I'll ask it for you. How long does my answer have to be? Because that's what everyone likes to know. I will also tell you right up front, that is a terrible question to ask your college professor. Okay, so don't ever ask it. Someone else is going to, so just wait until they ask it and you go like, oh, thank God it wasn't me. But because that tells the professor what's the least amount of work I can do and still get a passing grade. That's what we hear when we hear like, how long does it have to be? It's like, can't believe you're making me write. How long does it have to be? And our answer will always be long enough to answer the question because we're the smart Alex like that. But I will tell you that typically to get enough detail in your answer, it's about a page long, about a page long. Some people will be a little bit longer, some people a little bit shorter, but what I'm looking for is specific details. So like names of tribes or groups of tribes, probably in this instance, where they lived, something specific about them. So add some specific details, things that you couldn't just say before you looked at the textbook. I'm looking for some proof that you paid a little attention during my lecture, but you also looked in the textbook. That's really what I'm looking for. So details are really the way to show that to me, okay? And this question, because of the nature of the question, won't be as detailed. You're not going to have specific dates or events, but you can talk specifically about tribal groups and regions of the country, that sort of thing. So it won't be as, like in 1493 in what is now St. Louis, it won't be anything like that, but it will be specific enough to say an era and a region and some general tendencies of the group you're discussing. Does that make a little sense? Maybe. There. Okay. All right. All right. Now, we still have a few more minutes where, we could start with stuff for next week, but I probably don't want to. But I do want to see if you guys have any questions, any concerns, any trouble finding things. Are you all logged into Blackboard? If you haven't, please do. Like the second you log off of this class, go log into Blackboard. I'm assuming this isn't your first ACC class, so you've probably logged in before. But if not, make sure that you know how to do it. That's why, because that's where you have to submit your work. And if you wait to try to log in until next week on Friday and you can't log in, that's a problem. So if you haven't tried to log in, just do it and make sure you can log in. I think you have to use your student ID and first letter of your name or something. I don't know, but it even tells you what to do and how to activate your ID, that sort of thing. Pretty self-explanatory because even I could do it. Yeah, wasn't so bad. All right, but if you need help, there's also a helpline number that you can call for tech issues. Okay, I guess since I'm talking about helpline and tech issues, I can stop recording.